Hey, 12,000 Bombs fans, it's Lauren Warnicki. As you probably know, if you're listening to this, our WGLT Limited podcast on the science, policy, and personal impact of nuclear weapons and war wrapped up in October. But given the United States attacks on 3 of Iran's uranium enrichment sites over the weekend, I couldn't resist bringing nuclear physicist Matt Caplan back into the studio. So here's a bonus episode of 12,000 Bombs unpacking what happened, what didn't happen, what it means, and why we should care. Here's Matt. First and foremost, the community that you circulate in, how alarmed are you right now?
Very. This was a big, scary event, and American media is obviously focusing on an American perspective to this event and what comes next. Will there be diplomacy and peace talks and a renewal of the Iran nuclear deal? And all of this, I think, misses the point of actually what happened in Iran and how Iranians feel. There's widespread support now in Iran for the, I don't want to say regime, but the kind of nationalism that follows a surprise attack on a country.
Yeah, so let's back up just a little bit and kind of lay the groundwork. And I totally take the point of, like, on the surface level, like, we bombed a country that we're now demanding peace from. Why did we bomb a country?
Yes, why did the United States attack Iran? So I think what's important to point out, and I'm so glad that this was your follow-up, because Iran is one of the largest state sponsors of terror in the world. Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthi, these are all appendages of Iran abroad. This is how Iran exercises its sort of foreign policy goals, is through these non-state actors. So there's a reason that this attack has not necessarily been condemned, and in some cases is praised by leaders of European nations and really many heads of state. And the reason is that Iran is a state sponsor of terror, and this was a very calculated kind of attack on their enrichment facilities. So I think that that's a big point that is maybe missed, is the word nuclear is used a lot, but when I say nuclear and enrichment and purity, all of these words kind of just get jumbled together into the miasma of, okay, this is a nuclear issue, without really unpacking what these facilities were, what happens at them, and how they could eventually be used to produce a nuclear weapon.
So my understanding is that Iran does not have a nuclear weapon. They have developed some capability to produce a nuclear weapon, but they are doing that covertly and without sort of global agreement that they're allowed to do that, maybe related to this state sponsor of terror thing.
Yes, and that's exactly right. And so the Iran nuclear program began even before the Islamic Revolution, actually with U.S. support under the Shah. In recent years, since I'd say about the 90s, the Iranian regime has pursued this covert scheme, and that includes building some of these sites deep underground with the centrifuges, which they kept secret. And again, it's the sneakiness that's really alarming to the world. Any major regional power comparable to Iran, if I was to pick another, let's say economically similar country, let's say Brazil, something that's a large, regionally important nation, there's very good reasons for these countries to have nuclear programs. Isotopes that come from reactors are useful in every industrial application and agricultural applications. There's a reason to have domestic nuclear capabilities, just like there is to have domestic spaceflight if you want to launch a satellite. The thing that sets Iran apart from any other country that has a nuclear program is very clandestine enrichment activities. And that is really the signal to the rest of the world that this is secretly in service of a nuclear weapons program, even if they haven't committed to building a nuclear weapon. The idea, and of course from their own destroy Israel rhetoric, is that the only interpretation from someone outside who's taking this, thinking critically about it, is that they, or the Iranian regime, wants the capability to produce a nuclear weapon should they decide they need it, even if they haven't pulled the trigger and said, okay, start building one right now. And the key to that is highly enriched uranium.
And I take your point that there are maybe sort of domestic, non-war related applications for this so-called enrichment of uranium. So what does that mean? And is there a difference? Is the process the same whether you're using it for good or using it for building weapons?
Yes, I love this question. So Iran has pursued what is called the full fuel cycle, meaning that is taking uranium ore from the ground, converting it into this thing called uranium hexafluoride, or hex, which is a gas, and then processing that gas over and over and over again to enrich the uranium. If I can nerd out for just a minute, uranium comes in two isotopes, meaning they both have 92 protons to be the element uranium, but different numbers of neutrons. Uranium-235, that is what is used to make nuclear weapons and fuel for reactors. 238 is kind of a dud. So these two isotopes have very different personalities. And most uranium in the ground is 238. 99%. I can't remember the exact figure. So you need to separate the 238 from the 235, and that's enrichment, is getting the 235 fraction up from its natural value of 1% to 20% or so for a reactor, or 90% or so for a bomb.
So you can manufacture the type, you can kind of synthetically
So
create
that is what a
other
centrifuge
isotope.
does.
Okay.
So a centrifuge spins, right? This is what we all know. So the reason that you spin it, the reason you spin this gas, is that 238 is heavier than 235, because 238 is a bigger number. And this causes them to separate like oil and water, or a helium balloon goes up, you trigger this buoyant force, and the 235 floats to the top. And if you scrape the 235 off of the top and you put it in the next centrifuge, by daisy chaining these, or cascading is what it's called, by connecting the centrifuges in a sequence, the uranium hexafluoride gas gets to higher and higher concentrations of the dangerous isotope, or the useful isotope of 235.
Okay.
So anyone who wants to run a reactor needs to get up to 20% enrichment, and you're going to use centrifuges for that. But if you push beyond 20%, that's a scary thing to the outside world, especially if you push towards 60, 70, 80, 90%. So the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, commonly known as the Iran nuclear deal, put limits on how much they could, how many centrifuges they could have in these facilities that were attacked, what enrichment they could get to, the stockpiles they could have, and allowed outside inspectors in. So the Iran nuclear deal was this really essential piece of regulation or agreement that put huge limits on Iran's ability to clandestinely enrich uranium. And after Donald Trump pulled out of this deal in 2018, it basically gave Iran no reason to comply with these other stipulations. And Iran continued to push this very aggressive enrichment campaign. And so these strikes that were carried out over the weekend, I would say, are a direct result of the United States withdrawing from this deal in 2018.
So I think that there was some difference of opinions in the administration about the level of threat posed by, whether or not we should have pulled out of that deal. They were doing this, but their capacity to actually make a nuclear bomb, I think, was maybe being disagreed upon within the administration, to the point that the president said, I don't care what my national security or my national intelligence director says. I think that they're making a bomb. And so I guess my question is, if Iran has kind of been a perpetual threat for several years, why now? Why is now the moment where we need to kind of address those facilities, and why using this method?
That's a really good question. So I am not going to necessarily defend the choices of the administration. I just want to put it in context. The timing is a consequence of the Israeli strikes on Iran. So October 7th, 2 years ago, was the major Hamas attack in Israel. And while that was a terrorist attack, that was, by extension of Iran's sort of arming these groups, that was an attack by Iran and Iranian proxies on Israel. So in the broader context of the conflict, this is now the sort of current iteration of Israel's conflicts in the Middle East. All of these groups have been armed by Iran. And Hezbollah, for example, the pager attack also that crippled Hezbollah, one of those pagers was possessed by an Iranian ambassador to Lebanon. So all of these militias and armed groups that have been attacking Israel are armed by Iran. Israel knows this. Israel has very capable intelligence of what's going on in Iran. And Israel has been exchanging missiles, these long-range ballistic missiles with Iran. Israel, about a week ago, had a very successful surprise attack on a lot of Iranian infrastructure. Commandos, drones, and missiles of their own attacked their air defenses, attacked their ballistic missile capabilities, attacked their nuclear capabilities, and assassinated high-ranking generals and even nuclear physicists that run their nuclear program. This has been a tactic of Israel for a long time to slow down the Iranian nuclear program. There's a Wikipedia article, a list of Iranian nuclear physicists who have been assassinated by Israel. The major targets, Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan, these include these deep underground enrichment facilities that Israel does not have the weapons or the capability to hit directly, but the United States does. And so with the Israeli attacks directly on Iranian soil, there's a very limited window where Iranian air defenses are basically completely offline, where Iran might be able to be caught still by surprise a little bit. And we're already hearing reports that Iran has moved their uranium stockpiles in advance. It only amounts to a couple tons of material, but you only need a few tens of kilograms to make a bomb. So the timeliness was that this was time sensitive in the aftermath of these Israeli missile attacks.
So to what extent, I mean, and I take your point that there have been kind of conflicting reports about the effectiveness of this attack to actually destroy those facilities and therefore destroy Iran's capability to produce a nuclear bomb.
That's right. We'll only know in months to years how true that is, unless Iran comes out and says these facilities are completely destroyed and they show the pictures.
Right.
I can't imagine something like that happening. I imagine this will be lost in the fog of war for quite some time.
And because we also don't yet know how Iran intends to respond.
That's correct.
In terms of retaliation. We have said, well, we did this, and now you should come to the negotiating table through diplomacy. That's our ask. We don't know if they'll accept that. And so I guess this kind of gets to the, why should we care as Americans over here?
Okay, here's the obvious one. As has always been Iran's card, closing the Strait of Hormuz. So oil prices are going to go up. And I can say that without sparking huge alarm because the United States is the largest oil producer in the world and has been for some time. The U.S. has ramped up domestic oil production in order to get off foreign oil reliance a lot in the past 20 years. So yes, oil prices are going to go up, but you don't really need to rush to fill your tank unless you want to save a couple dollars. I can't imagine there's going to be huge changes in the price of gas in the United States. But this could certainly affect, for example, China and other nations that do rely much more heavily on Middle Eastern oil. The other card that Iran still has, even with their ballistic missile capabilities significantly degraded, is cyber attacks. So I think we're already seeing some evidence of that. How successful and how sophisticated they are remains to be seen. But I think those are the offensive cards that are sort of on the table for Iran.
And yet you say that you are very concerned.
Yeah, I am. There's a few reasons. The first is the unconstitutionality of the United States president undertaking an act of war against a country that we are not at war with. This is a congressional power. The second is that the United States is now being involved in an armed conflict in the Middle East. And, well, I don't need to unpack that. We've all been here. We know how this goes. So whether or not this is just a limited strike and a precision strike on their industrial capabilities to enrich uranium, or now the United States is committing to a longer-term campaign in part with Israel, something that only history will show.
And so there are the kind of intangibles that you talk about. Maybe gas prices go up a little bit. Maybe we're concerned about existential questions that are almost more ethical questions than literal questions, right? But how or will we feel this in some way? I think, as someone who myself has grown up most of my adolescent and adult life, our country being at war, but not really feeling it, not really feeling a personal impact unless you have a family member who's a service member, for example. So is there a risk of us feeling this more acutely in sort of the longitudinal arc?
I wondered about this myself after I saw those headlines on Saturday night, because I remember the start of the Iraq War began with a bombing campaign in Baghdad, and the United States was already in Afghanistan, and it just sort of felt surreal that it was all happening again and that there would be boots on the ground in no time. And I was kind of mulling it over. Am I feeling that same thing right now? Or is this like, oh, there was a drone strike in the tribal areas of Pakistan. We're not at war with Pakistan, but Obama or President Bush says that they have killed some terrorist leader that was operating in that region. And Iran, as this kind of terrorist, I won't say rogue state, but state sponsor of terror, being struck in this way, is in some way measured and is in many ways escalatory. This is the first U.S. involvement in Iran directly beyond just providing material support through its proxy, Israel. So history is going to be the thing that tells us. And I don't think Americans are generally in support of an invasion of Iran. But if we're lucky, all of this blows over. But I have a feeling that that's not how it goes. I have a feeling we'll see more escalation and more violence in the region before anything improves. There was a great quote by a guy in Chicago who I follow on Blue Sky. He said, "Stop the tragedy of war before it becomes an irreparable abyss." And I thought that was a really nice thing for Pope Leo to say.
There's also kind of the added layer that Iran is not a benign actor on the world stage. There are grave human rights violations to consider. And I would imagine that Iran, and I don't expect you to speak for Iranian Americans or immigrants or anything like that, but just as kind of an observer of this global stage and a person who has deeper knowledge of the players and the instruments that are involved, I imagine there are some conflicting feelings about a potential value of engagement with Iran in order to move that in a more democratic direction.
Yeah, and one thing I would like to do with this question is unpack what Iran means. Iran is as many different things as the United States. This is a massive country with a very diverse population. There is a regime with the Ayatollah that is a dictatorship. It's a theocracy, essentially. There is there's the military. There are regular people, and there are lots of young women in Tehran who are protesting the hijab, who are very progressive. Many of them come to the United States. They come to Europe to get educations, partly because they're trying to escape that environment, partly because they are just regular young people like we have at Illinois State. And so when we say Iran, we're sort of mixing all of these things together. There is domestic opposition to the regime and to these wars in Iran, just like there is in the United States. And then there is a pro-war element, and that includes elements of the government. So I think that's a really important thing for Americans to try and remember, is that Iran is not one actor. It is not one person, even if like a TV show would distill something into a composite character. We treat Iran like it's one character, and it's not.
Mm-hmm. As someone who has kind of committed much of your platform to diminishing and perhaps unrealistically abolishing nuclear weapons, I think it's another take on this. Like, could there be a benefit? Maybe the methods aren't what you would choose to de-escalate the potential for an Iranian nuclear program, but if it meets the goal, can you justify the means?
This is another very good question. I'm trying to have a bird's eye view of this and not come at it as an American, but maybe just as a sort of third party observer looking at the conflict. If I want a safer world, I want a world with fewer nuclear weapons and fewer countries having nuclear weapons. And in that sense, this was a very successful, tentatively strike, depending on what this means for Iran's ability to continue enriching. Certainly, the damage at Natanz and Isfahan is significant. But I think that it's ultimately going to set back any sort of long-term diplomacy. You don't defeat nuclear weapons by bombing them. The only progress that has ever been made in nuclear disarmament has been at the table. And the nuclear deal from 2015, which is long since gone, is even less likely to return in a new form after Iran has just been attacked. There's not much incentive for the Iranian government to think that they can achieve things at the negotiating table with the United States now being an active aggressor. So maybe we'll see other nations take greater leadership now that the United States is somewhat abdicating its role in this. We might see Germany or the other members of the UN Security Council step up to lead these negotiations. But I think the U.S. has, in taking this strike, reduced its future ability to achieve diplomatic successes.
Well, I don't know, but I've been told uranium ore's worth more than gold. Sold my cad, I bought me a Jeep, I got that bug and I can't sleep. Uranium fever has done and got me down. Uranium fever is spreading all around. With a Geiger counter in my hand,
I'm going out to stake me some government land.
Uranium fever has done and got me down. Well, I had a talk with the AEC and they brought out
This bonus episode of 12,000 Bombs was produced and edited by me, Lauren Warnicki. There's much, much more on the science of nuclear energy, geopolitics, and the fog of war in previous episodes of 12,000 Bombs. I'm biased, but if you haven't listened yet, it's great. This is WGLT and WGLT.org, part of the NPR network.
with a Geiger counter in my hand.
I'm going out to stake me some government land.
Uranium fever has done and got me down. Well, I took my Geiger and I started to climb right up to the top where I thought I'd find a hunk of rock that'd make it click just like I'd read about Vernon Pick. On the second day, I made the top, and I'm telling you, Steve, I was ready to stop. The only clicking that I heard that day was the bones in my back that had gone astray. Uranium fever has done and got me down. Uranium fever, it's spreading all around. With a Geiger counter in my hand,
I'm going out to stake me some government land.
uranium fever has done and got me down. Well, you pack up your things, you head out again into some unknown spot where nobody's been. You reach the spot where your fortune lies. You find it's been staked by 17 other guys. Well, I ain't kidding, I ain't gonna quit. That bug's done caught me and I've been bit. So with a Geiger counter and a pick in my hand, I'll keep right on staking that government land. Uranium fever has done and got me down. Uranium fever is spreading all around. With a Geiger counter in my hand,
I'm going out to stake me some government land.
uranium fever has done and got me down.